It was a cold morning in December 1956, and a man named Wilbur Creech sat behind the wheel of his 1953 International Harvester truck, parked on a two-lane blacktop just outside Effingham, Illinois. His breath fogged the windshield as he waited for the sun to burn off a thick blanket of frost. The load in his trailer was 6 tons of canned vegetables, bound for a grocery wholesaler in St. Louis, a trip that should have taken him about 3 hours. But on that particular morning, Creech knew he would be lucky if he made it by nightfall. The road ahead was a patchwork of local farm routes and state highways, each one a gamble. Some stretches were paved, some were gravel, and some were nothing more than muddy ruts that followed old wagon trails. Bridges were narrow, often weight-limited, and had sharp turns at both ends. Every 10 or 15 miles, he would have to stop at a small town, slow down to 15 miles per hour through the main street, and then pick his way back out into open country. A simple run from Effingham to St. Louis, just over 100 miles, could take an entire day and require more than a dozen different road maps. And that was only if the weather held. Creech was not alone. Hundreds of thousands of truck drivers across the United States in the 1950s faced the same grinding reality every single shift. American highways at that time were a mess. There was no unified system. The federal government had built some major routes like U.S. Route 1 and U.S. Route 66, but those were still mostly two-lane roads that cut straight through every city, town, and hamlet along the way. Traffic lights, railroad crossings, sharp curves, and steep grades were the norm. A long haul from Chicago to Los Angeles, which today a trucker can cover in about 30 hours on a 4-lane interstate, could take a week of hard driving in those days if the driver was lucky. The roads were dangerous, too. In 1955, the year before Creech made that cold December run, more than 36,000 people died on American highways, and a significant number of those fatalities involved trucks crashing into cars at intersections or overtaking on curves where visibility was poor. The trucking industry itself was growing fast, but it was held back by a road network that was essentially stuck in the horse and buggy era. The man who would change all of that was a former general who had seen the Autobahns of Germany during World War II. Dwight David Eisenhower, who became president in 1953, had been deeply impressed by the way those high-speed, divided highways allowed the German military to move troops and supplies rapidly across great distances. He had also, in 1919, taken part in a cross-country military convoy that took 62 days to travel from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. That journey had been a nightmare of broken axles, stuck vehicles, and washed-out roads. Eisenhower never forgot it. As president, he saw a modern highway system as an essential tool for national defense, for economic growth, and for bringing a fractured nation together. In 1956, he signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, a law that authorized the construction of more than 41,000 miles of interstate highways. The official name was the Dwight D. Eisenhower National System of Interstate and Defense Highways, but everyone just called it the Interstate. The impact on the American trucking industry was immediate and transformative. It was not just a new road. It was a new way of thinking about how goods moved. The interstate was designed with trucks in mind. It had limited access, meaning no driveways or local streets feeding directly onto it. It had divided lanes to prevent head-on collisions. It had controlled entrances and exits via ramps. It had gentle curves and steady grades so that trucks could maintain speed and fuel efficiency. And it had a minimum speed limit, usually 40 miles per hour, which meant that slow-moving farm tractors and horse-drawn buggies were banned. For the first time, a truck driver could get into the cab, point the rig toward a destination 1,000 miles away, and drive without ever stopping at a traffic light. The interstate took the guesswork out of long-haul trucking. Consider the economics. Before the interstate, shipping goods by truck was expensive and unpredictable. A load of produce from California to New York might spoil because the truck got stuck in traffic at a narrow bridge in Pennsylvania. A shipment of steel from Pittsburgh to Detroit could be delayed by a broken-down logging truck on a 2-lane road in Ohio. Insurance rates were high because accidents were frequent. Trucking companies had to hire local drivers who knew the back roads, because a route that looked good on a map might have a low-clearance railroad trestle or a bridge that could not support a loaded semi. The interstate solved all of that. It provided a standardized, nationwide network of roads that were built to the same specifications. A trucking company could now calculate shipping times with accuracy, plan routes with confidence, and reduce the number of trucks sitting idle or stuck in traffic. The cost of moving goods dropped sharply, and that drop echoed through the entire economy. In the first decade after the interstate system began to take shape, the number of registered trucks on American roads increased by nearly 60%. But more important than the raw numbers was the change in what those trucks could do. The old system of regional distribution, where goods were moved by rail from factory to warehouse, and then by truck for short local deliveries, began to give way to something new: intercity and transcontinental trucking. A truck could now leave a factory in Detroit at 6 o'clock in the morning, travel at 55 miles per hour on a 4-lane freeway, and be at a loading dock in Atlanta by midnight. That was simply impossible on the old roads. The trucking industry ceased to be a local service and became a national backbone. The story of that change is not just about concrete and asphalt. It is about people like Wilbur Creech, who saw the first segments of Interstate 70 open near his home in Illinois. He remembered driving on the brand new highway the week it opened in 1960, with no other vehicles in sight, just smooth pavement stretching to the horizon. He said later that it felt like he was flying. He could set the cruise control, if his old International even had one, and just let the miles roll under him. He made that run from Effingham to St. Louis in 2 hours flat. That was a journey that had taken him 8 hours just 4 years earlier. For a truck driver paid by the mile, that was a revolution. It meant he could do 2 runs in a day instead of 1. It meant he could be home with his family at night instead of sleeping in a cramped bunk at a truck stop. It meant safer roads, fewer breakdowns, and a whole new sense of professionalism in an industry that had long been seen as a rough, dangerous job. The interstate also changed the geography of trucking. Before it, most trucking terminals and distribution centers were located in the center of cities, near rail yards or river ports. Trucks would wind their way through crowded city streets to get to those depots. The new highways typically bypassed downtown areas, with exits and interchanges built on the outskirts of towns. That shift led to the rise of industrial parks and distribution hubs located near interstate exits, far from congested urban cores. Trucking companies built sprawling terminals with dozens of loading docks right off the highway. Warehouses sprang up alongside the interstates, and soon the whole pattern of American commerce began to reorganize itself around the ribbons of concrete that crisscrossed the land. One example that drives home the scale of this change is the town of Galesburg, Illinois, a small city on the Burlington Northern Rail line. In the 1950s, Galesburg was a railroad town with a bustling freight yard and a large roundhouse. But when Interstate 74 was built just north of town, everything began to shift. Trucking companies came in. They built terminals near the interchange. A new industrial park was developed. Within a decade, Galesburg had become a hub for over-the-road trucking, and the railroad yard began to shrink. The same story played out in hundreds of communities across America. Towns that were bypassed by the interstate withered, while those that had a convenient exit flourished. The highway did not just change how trucks moved, it changed where people lived and worked. But the interstate was not built overnight. The original plan called for the system to be completed by 1972, but delays, funding battles, and environmental concerns pushed the final completion of the original network into the 1990s. During those decades of construction, the trucking industry adapted and evolved in step with the new roads. Truck manufacturers began building bigger, faster, more aerodynamic rigs designed to cruise at highway speeds. Tires improved, brakes improved. The standard diesel engine became more powerful and more efficient. All of that innovation was driven by the existence of the interstate, a road system that allowed trucks to operate at their full potential. There is a story that illustrates just how profound the change was. In the early 1960s, a trucking company called Consolidated Freightways became the first to offer transcontinental service entirely by truck, without using railroads at all, on the new interstates. Before that, any freight moving from coast to coast had to go by rail at least part of the way, because road conditions made it impractical for a single truck to make the entire trip. Consolidated Freightways took a gamble. They bought a fleet of new Kenworth trucks with sleeper cabs, hired teams of 2 drivers who could alternate driving, and sent the loads straight through from Los Angeles to New York on the interstates. The trip took 70 hours, a record at the time. The company proved that it could be done, and soon other carriers followed. The railroads, which had dominated long-haul freight for a century, found themselves losing market share to trucks. The interstate had leveled the playing field. There were downsides, of course. The interstate system made truck driving a lonelier job. Before the interstates, a trucker spent a lot of time in small towns, stopping at diners and cafes, talking to locals, being part of a community. The new highways bypassed those towns entirely. Truck stops grew larger and more impersonal, with diesel pumps and fast food chains replacing mom-and-pop restaurants. Drivers spent hours staring at concrete barriers and road signs, with no scenery to speak of. The romance of the open road, the idea of the trucker as a lone cowboy, gave way to the reality of a professional driver grinding out miles in a regulated, efficiency-driven industry. The interstate made trucking safer and more profitable, but it also made it more anonymous. The economic impact of the interstate on the trucking industry cannot be overstated. In 1956, the year the law was signed, trucking accounted for about 18% of total intercity freight tonnage in the United States. By 1970, with thousands of miles of interstates open, that share had risen to more than 35%. By 1990, trucks carried over 40% of all intercity freight, a figure that continues to climb today. The interstate system allowed the trucking industry to capture a massive slice of the freight market, much of it from the railroads. In the process, trucking became the dominant force in American logistics. It shaped the way goods are produced, distributed, and sold, from the factory floor to the store shelf. One of the most telling examples of how the interstate changed the trucking industry is the rise of just-in-time manufacturing. That system, pioneered by Japanese automakers in the 1970s and adopted by American companies in the 1980s, requires that parts arrive at the assembly line exactly when they are needed, with no inventory buffer. It places enormous demands on trucking companies. They must deliver reliably, on schedule, every time. The interstate made that possible. Without a high-speed, reliable road network, just-in-time would have been an impossible dream. A truck stuck in traffic on a two-lane road could shut down an entire factory. The interstate removed that risk. It gave manufacturers confidence that their supply chains would hold. As the final segments of the interstate system were being completed in the early 1990s, the trucking industry underwent yet another transformation. Deregulation in 1980 had already opened the industry to more competition and lowered barriers for new entrants. The combination of a mature interstate network and a deregulated marketplace led to an explosion of independent owner-operators. Men and women could buy a truck, get a loan, and start hauling freight on the open market. They could drive from coast to coast on roads that were safe, efficient, and uniform. The interstate had democratized the industry. It was no longer just for big companies with deep pockets. Anyone with a valid commercial driver's license and a reliable truck could become a part of the American trucking story. And what a story it is. It is a story of concrete and steel, of political compromise and engineering marvels. But more than that, it is a story of people like Wilbur Creech, who saw a highway open up in front of him and realized that the world had changed forever. It is the story of the truck drivers who used those new roads to build a network of commerce that reaches every corner of the country. It is a story that continues to unfold every day as millions of trucks roll across the interstates, delivering the goods that keep America running. And it all began with a simple idea, that a road could be more than just a path from one place to another. It could be a lifeline. It could be the highway that changed everything. Wilbur Creech was not a famous man. He was a truck driver from a small town in Missouri, one of thousands who took to the road in the 1960s. But his story captures the reality of what the interstate meant for ordinary Americans. Wilbur grew up on a farm, and when he turned 21, he borrowed money from his uncle to buy a 1953 International Harvester. It was a used truck, beat up and worn out, but it was his. In the old days, running a truck like that meant sticking to state highways, crawling through towns, and taking hours to cover what the interstate could do in minutes. Wilbur tried that for a year. He barely made enough to cover his loan payments. Then the first segment of Interstate 44 opened near his home, and everything changed. Wilbur took a load of auto parts from St. Louis to Oklahoma City, a run that used to take him nearly 12 hours on the old two-lane roads, with stops in every small town and endless delays behind slow farm traffic. On the new interstate, he made it in 7 hours. He could deliver more loads in a week, earn more money, and even sleep in his own bed a few nights. He told a reporter in 1965 that the interstate was like getting a raise without asking for one. He paid off his truck in 2 years. He bought a newer one. He hired his brother to drive with him. That is the story of thousands of small operators who got their start because the interstate made long-haul trucking accessible to anyone willing to work hard. But the interstate did not just change the economics of trucking. It changed the culture of the road itself. In the 1960s and 1970s, a distinct trucker subculture emerged. built around the new world of high-speed, long-distance driving. The interstate highway system created a network of truck stops that were no longer just gas stations with a diner attached. They became full-service operations, with repair bays, showers, laundromats, and even small motels. Drivers could park their rigs, eat a hot meal, and get back on the road without ever leaving the interstate corridor. That efficiency came at a cost. The old truck stops, the ones on the two-lane highways in the middle of town, closed one by one. They had been places where drivers knew the waitress by name, where the owner would extend a line of credit to a regular, where a driver could call home from a payphone and feel connected. The new truck stops were anonymous, corporate, and efficient. The interstate also gave rise to the CB radio craze. Citizens band radios had been around since the 1940s, but they were mostly used by farmers and emergency services. In the 1970s, truckers began using them to communicate on the interstates. They created a code language, a set of nicknames, a way to warn each other about speed traps or accidents or bad weather. A driver could roll down the window, pick up the mic, and say, "Breaker 19, this is Bandit on the eastbound side, looking for a clear shot." Suddenly, the loneliness of the interstate was not so lonely. There was a whole community out there, talking to each other across the concrete divide. The CB radio became a symbol of trucker culture, romanticized in movies like Smokey and the Bandit and songs like Convoy. That movie, by the way, was inspired by real events. A nationwide trucker protest in 1973 against the 55 miles per hour speed limit that had been imposed during the oil crisis. The interstate had made high speeds possible, and the new limit felt like a betrayal. Truckers used their CBs to organize convoys, block highways, and demand change. They had found a voice. The speed limit issue was a major turning point. The federal government imposed the national maximum speed limit of 55 miles per hour in 1974, hoping to reduce fuel consumption during the Arab oil embargo. For the trucking industry, it was a disaster. Trucks were designed to cruise at 65 or 70 on the interstates. Dropping to 55 meant longer drive times, fewer deliveries per week, and lower pay for owner-operators who were paid by the mile. Some drivers ignored the limit and paid the fines, which they considered a cost of doing business. But the real consequence was a loss of productivity that rippled through the supply chain. It took years for the industry to adapt, and the limit was not lifted until 1987 for rural interstates, and then fully repealed in 1995. The whole episode showed how dependent trucking had become on the interstate system. A change in the rules on those roads could affect the entire economy. Another unintended consequence of the interstate system was the rise of the just-in-time supply chain, which we touched on earlier. But the full story is even more dramatic. In the 1980s, companies like Toyota and Honda built assembly plants in the United States, mostly in the Ohio River Valley and the Southeast. They demanded that their parts suppliers locate very close to the factories, often within a few hours' drive, so that parts could be delivered multiple times a day. The interstate made that feasible. Suppliers built warehouses right off the interstate exits, with loading docks on one side and a dedicated fleet of trucks on the other. The trucks would roll out every few hours, running a loop between supplier and factory, using the interstate like a conveyor belt. That system is now standard across almost every manufacturing industry, from electronics to food processing. The interstate is the backbone of just-in-time logistics, and without it, global supply chains would collapse. But the interstate also created problems that trucking is still grappling with today. One of the most serious is parking. When the interstate system was designed in the 1950s, no one anticipated the sheer volume of trucks that would be on the road. Rest areas were built for passenger cars, with a few picnic tables and a bathroom. Truck parking was an afterthought. As the number of trucks grew, so did the demand for safe places to park. Driver hours of service regulations require that truckers take a 10-hour rest break after driving 11 hours, but there are nowhere near enough parking spots to accommodate them. On many interstates, rest areas fill up by mid-afternoon, leaving drivers to park on exit ramps in abandoned lots or along the shoulder. That is dangerous and illegal, but drivers have no choice. Several fatal accidents have been caused by trucks parked on highway shoulders. The federal government has spent billions to add truck parking, but demand continues to outstrip supply. It is a problem that was born from the interstate itself. There is also the issue of congestion. The interstate system is now decades old, and some sections in major metropolitan areas are hopelessly overcrowded. Truck drivers spend hours creeping through traffic in places like Atlanta, Chicago, or Los Angeles, where the interstates were never designed to handle the current volume. That congestion costs the industry billions of dollars in wasted fuel and lost time. The trucking companies try to route around it, using GPS and real-time traffic data, but sometimes there is no alternative. The interstate that was supposed to speed up freight movement has become a bottleneck in the very places where it matters most. And yet, the interstate remains the single most important piece of infrastructure for the trucking industry. Its impact is woven into every aspect of American life. Think about a simple item like a can of soda. The aluminum comes from a smelter that ships bauxite from Australia to a port, then by rail to the smelter, then by truck to a can manufacturer. The can manufacturer ships the empty cans to a bottling plant, which receives syrup from another truck and sugar from yet another. The finished soda goes to a distribution center, then to a store, all by truck. Each of those truck trips uses the interstate for at least part of the journey. Without the interstate, that can of soda would cost more, take longer to arrive, and might not be available at all in many places. The transformation of the American landscape is also part of the story. The interstate system created a new geography of commerce. Towns that had been founded on rivers or railroads suddenly found themselves on the highway map, while those that were bypassed faded away. Think of the town of Effingham, Illinois, which sits at the junction of Interstates 57 and 70. Before the interstates, Effingham was a quiet farming community. After the interstates opened, it became a major truck stop hub. Today it has dozens of truck stops, motels, and distribution centers. The town boomed. Meanwhile, the nearby town of Vandalia, which had been a stop on the historic National Road and later on U.S. Highway 40, saw its traffic dwindle when I-70 bypassed it. Vandalia's downtown slowly emptied, its motels and diners closed, and it became a shadow of what it once was. The interstate did not just change trucking, it redrew the economic map of America. The interstate also changed the truck itself. In the 1950s, most trucks were designed for speeds of around 50 miles per hour. Their engines were loud and inefficient. Their cabs were cramped, with no air conditioning and minimal insulation. As the interstates opened, truck manufacturers responded. The new generation of trucks, like the Kenworth W900 and the Peterbilt 359, were built for the interstates. They had larger, more powerful engines, aerodynamic shapes, and comfortable sleeper cabs. They could maintain 70 miles per hour for hours on end, with fuel efficiency that would have been unthinkable on the old roads. The truck became a machine of the open road, capable of covering 2,000 miles in a week without breaking down. That technology trickled down to smaller trucks, too. Even a local delivery truck, which might never see an interstate, benefited from the engineering advances spurred by the highway system. The interstate also standardized the industry. Before the interstate, a truck that operated in New England had different specifications than one operating in the Rocky Mountains. Axle configurations, weight limits, and even bridge clearances varied from state to state. The interstate system came with federal design standards, including a minimum clearance of 16 feet for bridges, a maximum grade of 3%, and a minimum lane width of 12 feet. Truck manufacturers adopted those standards as a baseline. They built trucks that could fit under any bridge and climb any hill on the interstate network. That standardization made it easier for carriers to operate nationwide, and it reduced costs. A truck could roll from Maine to California without encountering a road it could not handle. But the interstate also made trucking more regulated. As the highway system grew, so did the need for rules to ensure safety. The federal government began setting standards for brakes, lights, and tires. It established hours of service regulations in 1939, but those were rarely enforced until the interstates made long-haul trucking common. In the 1970s, the Bureau of Motor Carrier Safety started using the interstate as a natural laboratory. They set up weigh stations and inspection checkpoints at interstate exits. They pulled trucks over for random inspections. The interstate became a place where the law met the road, and truckers had to obey or face consequences. That was a good thing for safety, but it also added a layer of bureaucracy that small operators found burdensome. One cannot tell the story of the interstate and trucking without mentioning the rise of the megacarrier. Before 1956, most trucking companies were small, regional operations. The interstate allowed companies like Schneider National and J.B. Hunt to expand massively. They built huge terminal networks around the country, with centralized dispatch and maintenance. They used the interstates to run dedicated lanes, where a truck might drive the same route every day, picking up and delivering freight at the same factories and distribution centers. That efficiency drove down costs. but it also squeezed out many of the small owner-operators who could not compete with the scale and technology of the big carriers. The interstate system favored consolidation. The same roads that gave Wilbur Creech a start also, eventually, made it harder for drivers like him to stay independent. In the end, the interstate system is a monument to ambition. It was built during a time when America believed it could achieve anything through engineering and determination. The trucking industry rode that ambition to the top of the freight world, but the interstate also gave us a system that is now aging, congested, and in need of repair. The concrete is cracking, the bridges are rusting, the money to maintain the system is never enough. Yet every day, millions of trucks roll across those same roads, doing the same job they did in the 1960s, delivering the goods that make modern life possible. The highway that changed everything is now so ordinary that we take it for granted, but it is still there, a network of 15,000 miles of concrete and steel binding the nation together, and the trucks keep running. We forget sometimes that the interstate is not just concrete and steel. It is a living thing, a network of stories carried by the people who drive those trucks. Every day, hundreds of thousands of men and women climb into their cabs, start their engines, and merge onto the same roads that Wilbur Creech drove 60 years ago. Their lives are shaped by the interstate in ways that are both profound and invisible. A driver named Mike, for example, runs a dedicated lane between Memphis and Los Angeles. He leaves his home in Tennessee on Sunday night and does not return until Friday afternoon. His truck is his office, his bedroom, his kitchen. He knows the exact mile marker where the best truck stop coffee is, the stretch of I-40 in Oklahoma where the wind is worst, the way station in California that never seems to close. The interstate is his world. It gives him a living, but it also takes a toll. The long hours, the loneliness, the constant hum of the tires on concrete, it changes a person. Mike says he has seen sunrises and sunsets from the same stretch of road, and sometimes he cannot remember which is which. The interstate blurs time. That blurring is part of a deeper problem. The trucking industry has always struggled with the human cost of long-haul driving. In the early days, drivers drove until they could not stay awake, then pulled over and slept in the cab. That was dangerous, and the federal government eventually stepped in. Hours of service regulations were tightened over the decades, but the interstate made enforcement both easier and harder. Easier because trucks could be stopped at weigh stations and checked. Harder because the distances were so vast. A driver could start in New Jersey and be in Ohio before a logbook check mattered. The interstate created a cat-and-mouse game between regulators and drivers. Some drivers kept two logbooks, one for the company and one for reality. They called the real one the sleeper book. That culture of deception lasted for decades, and the interstate was the stage on which it played out. Then came the electronic logging device, or ELD. In 2017, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration mandated ELDs for almost all commercial trucks. The device plugged into the engine and recorded driving hours automatically. It ended the paper logbook game. Many drivers resented it. They said it took away their flexibility, that it forced them to stop at inconvenient times, that it made the job harder. But safety advocates pointed out that hours of service violations had been a leading cause of fatal truck crashes. The ELD, combined with the interstate's long straight stretches, made it harder to cheat, but it also added a new layer of stress. A driver stuck in traffic on I-95 near Washington, D.C. watches his remaining driving time tick away, knowing that if he does not find parking soon, he will be forced to stop illegally. The interstate giveth and taketh away. The human story of the interstate also includes the places where drivers stop. Truck stops are more than just fuel stations. They are communities. The largest ones, like the Iowa 80 or the TA in Ontario, California, are like small cities. They have showers, laundromats, restaurants, barbershops, even movie theaters. Drivers know each other by their CB handles, and they share news about road conditions, weigh station inspections, and the best places to eat. The CB radio itself was born on the interstate. In the 1970s, drivers used it to warn each other about speed traps and smokies, the highway patrol. That culture evolved into a whole vocabulary: four-wheeler for a car, hammer down for full speed, chicken coop for a weigh station. The interstate became a place of oral tradition where stories were passed from driver to driver across generations. But that culture is fading. Younger drivers rely on smartphones and apps. They do not use the CB as much. The truck stops are still there, but the sense of community is thinning. The interstate still connects, but it also isolates. A driver can spend 12 hours behind the wheel without speaking to another person. The loneliness of the long-haul trucker is a cliché, but it is real. and the interstate, with its endless miles of divided highway, makes that loneliness possible. The interstate also made possible the transformation of the trucking industry after deregulation. In 1980, the Motor Carrier Act essentially ended the system of route and rate controls that had governed trucking since the 193s rose. Before 1980, a trucking company could only haul certain goods on certain routes, and the rates were set by the Interstate Commerce Commission. It was a cozy, regulated world. Big companies had protected territories and small carriers had their niches, but the interstate system had created a national network of highways, and deregulation allowed anyone with a truck and a license to use it. The result was chaos and opportunity. Thousands of new carriers flooded the market. Rates dropped. The big companies like Roadway and Consolidated Freightways struggled to compete with the nimble, low-cost operators. Many went bankrupt. The owner-operators who had thrived under regulation suddenly found themselves squeezed. They had to cut deals directly with shippers, often at razor-thin margins. The interstate, which had been a tool for efficiency, now became a battlefield. The survivors were the ones who could run the long hauls, use the interstates to maximize miles and minimize downtime. The industry consolidated. By the 190s, the big carriers were bigger than ever, but they were leaner, more efficient, and more reliant on technology. The interstate system was their backbone. That technology included the first satellite tracking systems. In the late 190s, companies like Qualcomm introduced the OmniTrack system, which allowed dispatchers to send messages to drivers via satellite. A small terminal in the cab displayed text messages. It was revolutionary. Before that, a driver had to pull over at a truck stop and call a phone number to get their next assignment. Now they could receive instructions on the road without stopping. The interstate, with its continuous flow, was the perfect environment for that kind of real-time communication. A truck could be rerouted in minutes, avoiding a traffic jam, a construction zone, or a sudden snowstorm. That efficiency was a direct product of the interstate's design. On the old two-lane roads, a detour might add an hour. On the interstate, a detour might add only 10 minutes because the interchanges were graded and the pavement was smooth. The combination of satellite tracking and interstate highways created the modern logistics industry. Companies like Walmart and Amazon built their supply chains around that speed. They demanded just-in-time delivery, where a truck arrived at a distribution center at exactly the right moment, not a minute earlier or later. The interstate made that scheduling possible. Without it, the warehouse shelves would be empty, and the online orders would not arrive in 2 days. But just-in-time delivery also put immense pressure on drivers. They were no longer just hauling freight. They were cogs in a machine that demanded precision. A driver who ran out of hours because of a traffic jam on I-75 might miss a delivery window, causing a penalty for the carrier. The driver's pay suffered. Many drivers are paid by the mile, not by the hour, so every minute of delay is money lost. The interstate, which was supposed to be the fastest route, became a source of anxiety. Drivers watch the clock, the GPS, and the fuel gauge simultaneously. They know that the interstate is not always the fastest. Sometimes a driver will take a state highway to avoid a way station or a notorious traffic bottleneck. But that is a gamble because a state highway might have low bridges, sharp curves, or bad pavement. The interstate is safer, but not always faster. The driver must make a choice. Those choices are the daily reality of trucking, and they are all shaped by the interstate system. The interstate also reshaped the relationship between trucking and the American consumer. Before the interstate, many goods were produced locally. There was a bakery in every town, a dairy within 50 miles, a slaughterhouse nearby. The interstate allowed for centralization. Factories could be built in rural areas, far from the cities, because they could ship their products nationwide on the interstates. One of the most dramatic examples is the consolidation of the dairy industry. In the 1960s, milk was produced and processed locally. The interstate allowed milk to be shipped hundreds of miles. Today, milk from Wisconsin is sold in Florida. A single tanker truck carries tens of thousands of gallons, driving nonstop on the interstates, keeping the milk cold with a refrigeration unit powered by a diesel engine. The cost of that transportation is built into the price of milk in the grocery store. But it also means that a disruption on the interstate, like a bridge closure or a major accident, can cause a shortage of dairy products in a whole region. The interstate system, for all its efficiency, has made the food supply chain fragile. It is a network of dependencies that no one thinks about until it breaks. The fragility became starkly visible during the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020, the interstates kept running. Truck drivers were declared essential workers. They kept delivering food, medical supplies, toilet paper, and everything else. But the pandemic also exposed the weak points. The supply chain was so finely tuned that a spike in demand for certain products caused panic. The interstates were clogged with trucks trying to restock stores that had been emptied by hoarding. Drivers worked longer hours, often without rest, to keep up. The parking crisis got worse. Rest areas were closed and truck stops limited services. Drivers slept in their cabs at empty warehouses, on ramps, anywhere they could park. The interstate, which had been the symbol of American mobility, became a symbol of the nation's vulnerability. It was a lifeline, but a frayed one. And now the interstate faces new challenges. One of the biggest is the transition to electric trucks. The technology is advancing, but the infrastructure is not ready. An electric truck needs a charging station that can deliver megawatts of power in minutes, not hours. The interstates have rest areas and truck stops that could host those chargers, but the electrical grid is not built for that load. A single charging station for a fleet of electric trucks might require as much power as a small town. The interstate, which was designed for diesel trucks with 5-minute fuel stops, will need to be redesigned for a new era. That will take billions of dollars and years of planning. The same is true for autonomous trucks. Self-driving technology is being tested on interstates, where the controlled environment and clear lane markings make it easier. But an autonomous truck still needs to be monitored, and it still needs parking. The interstate system, which was built for human drivers, will have to adapt to machines. That adaptation will not be easy. The concrete is already cracking, the bridges are aging, and the funding is uncertain. The interstate system is a monument to the 20th century. The question is whether it can survive the 21st, and yet the trucks keep running. They are there in the pre-dawn darkness, headlights cutting through the fog on 80 in Nebraska. They are there in the heat of the summer, pulling a grade on I-70 in the Rocky Mountains. They are there in the rain, in the snow, in the endless monotony of the Great Plains. The drivers see the same scenery, the same exits, the same signs. They know the interstate intimately. They can tell you which rest area has the cleanest bathrooms, which way station is most likely to inspect your brakes, which stretch of highway has a bad crosswind. The interstate is a world of small details. A crack in the pavement at mile marker 312, a deer crossing sign at mile marker 1050, a bridge with a low clearance that catches every rookie driver. These details are the texture of a trucker's life. The interstate is not just a road. It is a companion, an adversary, a home. It is the place where a driver spends more waking hours than anywhere else, and it is changing slowly but inexorably. The highway that changed the American trucking industry is still changing it, and the story is far from over. The story of the interstate and trucking is also the story of deregulation. In 1980, the Motor Carrier Act fundamentally changed the industry. Before that, the federal government tightly controlled trucking routes, rates, and who could enter the business. A carrier had to prove a public need existed before getting a route authority. That meant many routes were protected monopolies, and rates were high, stable, and predictable. Deregulation threw open the gates. Anyone with a truck and a license could haul anything, anywhere, at any price they could negotiate. The interstate, with its 4 lanes and smooth pavement, became the arena for a brutal Darwinian competition. Rates plummeted. Carriers that had been profitable for decades went bankrupt. Drivers who owned their own trucks became owner-operators, independent contractors who bore all the risks. They had to find their own loads, negotiate their own pay, and pay for their own fuel, maintenance, and insurance. The interstate was still the backbone, but now it was also a battleground. A driver on I-40 in the 180s might see a dozen trucks from a dozen different companies, all chasing the same load. The highway became a symbol of freedom, but also of uncertainty. The old trucking culture, with its union wages, regular hours, and seniority, was gone. In its place was a cutthroat industry where a driver might earn a good living one week and scrape by the next. The interstate system made that possible because it allowed a driver to cover 1,000 miles in a day, chasing the highest-paying load. But it also made it impossible for drivers to settle down. They became nomads, living in their trucks, sleeping in rest areas, eating at truck stops. The interstate was their home, but it was a lonely home. The deregulation also accelerated the consolidation of the trucking industry. The big carriers like Schneider, J.B. Hunt, Swift, Werner, and Crete grew by swallowing up smaller companies or simply driving them out of business. These mega carriers owned thousands of trucks and trailers, and they used the interstate system to operate with ruthless efficiency. They built giant terminals near major interstate interchanges, where they could swap trailers, repair trucks, and dispatch drivers. A driver might start their week by picking up a loaded trailer at a facility in Chicago, driving it to a terminal in Atlanta, dropping it, and then picking up another trailer headed to Dallas. The interstate was the conveyor belt that moved these trailers across the country. The mega carriers could afford the latest technology, the best maintenance, and the most aggressive safety programs. They could also negotiate lower rates with shippers because they had economies of scale. A small carrier with 4 trucks could not compete on price. They had to find a niche hauling specialized equipment, for example, or serving a specific region. But the interstate system, with its uniform standards, made it easier for the mega carriers to dominate. A shipper could load a trailer in Los Angeles and know it would arrive in New York in 4 days because the mega carrier had the network to move it seamlessly. The smaller guys could not offer that guarantee, so the small fleets evaporated. The number of trucking companies dropped, but the number of trucks on the road kept rising because the mega carriers kept adding capacity. The interstate was the engine of that growth, but it also became the stage for a bitter fight over rates, hours, and safety. That fight reached a critical juncture in the 1990s and 2000s when the hours of service regulations were overhauled. The federal government realized that driver fatigue was a major cause of accidents. A driver who had been on the road for 18 hours was a danger to themselves and everyone else. So the Department of Transportation instituted a strict set of rules. A driver could drive a maximum of 11 hours after 10 consecutive hours off duty and could not work more than 14 hours in a shift. Those rules were designed to prevent fatigue, but they also created a new set of problems. A driver who was stuck in traffic on I-95 in New Jersey for 2 hours might run out of those 11 driving hours before reaching the delivery point. They would have to stop, even if they were only 50 miles from the destination. The interstate, which was supposed to be the fastest route, became a trap. Drivers learned to hate the interstate for its unpredictability. A crash on I-5 in California could shut down the highway for hours, and a driver would lose their window. They would pull into a truck stop, shut off the engine, and wait. The waiting was the worst part. It was unpaid, it was boring, and it reminded the driver that they were not in control. The interstate system, for all its engineering marvels, could not guarantee a smooth ride. It was subject to the whims of weather, traffic, and human error. The driver was just a passenger in their own truck, waiting for the road to open again. The stress of that waiting, combined with the low pay and the loneliness, led to a chronic driver shortage. The American Trucking Association estimates that the industry is short tens of thousands of drivers. That number has been growing for years. The problem is not a lack of people with commercial driver's licenses. It is a lack of people willing to put up with the lifestyle. The interstate system, which was supposed to be a career path for millions of Americans, has become a deterrent. A driver spends weeks away from home, sleeps in a cramped bunk, eats at fast food restaurants, and struggles to find safe parking. The parking crisis is one of the most visible symptoms. There are not enough truck parking spaces at rest areas and truck stops to accommodate all the trucks that are required to stop after 11 hours. So drivers park on exit ramps in abandoned lots on the shoulders of frontage roads. They risk getting ticketed, towed, or hit by another truck. The interstate, which was designed with rest areas every 30 miles or so, cannot handle the volume. The rest areas were built for a time when a truck driver might stop for a coffee and a meal, not for a 10-hour rest. The bathrooms are too small, the parking lots are too small, the amenities are too sparse. A driver who is required to rest for 10 hours needs a shower, a meal, a place to stretch their legs. The rest areas do not provide that, so the trucks crowd into private truck stops, which charge for parking, or they park on the interstate itself, on the shoulder, in violation of the law. That is a disaster waiting to happen. A driver parked on the shoulder of I-75 at 2 in the morning is a sitting duck for a drunk driver or a tired driver. The interstate system, which was supposed to be the safest road network, is actually one of the most dangerous places to park a truck. The dangers are compounded by the aging infrastructure. The interstate system is over 60 years old. The concrete is crumbling, the bridges are rusting, and the interchanges are outdated. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives the interstate a grade of C or worse. In some places, the pavement is so worn that a driver can feel every imperfection through the steering wheel. The bridges are too low for modern trucks that are taller and heavier than the ones the interstate was designed for. The weight limits on some bridges force trucks to take detours onto local roads, which are even worse. The interstate system, which was supposed to be a national network, is now a patchwork of repairs and delays. A driver on I-70 in Missouri might encounter a construction zone that slows traffic to a crawl for 10 miles. That construction zone is a necessary evil, but it also costs the driver time and money. The interstate system, which was built to be permanent, is showing its age, and the funding to fix it is inadequate. The federal gas tax, which funds the Highway Trust Fund, has not been raised since 1993. It is a flat tax per gallon, and as cars become more fuel efficient, the revenue shrinks. The trucks pay a higher tax, but even that is not enough. The result is a backlog of deferred maintenance that grows every year. The interstate system, which changed the trucking industry, is now being changed by the very industry it created. The trucks are wearing out the road, and there is not enough money to keep it in good shape. The future of the interstate and trucking is uncertain, but there are glimmers of hope. The bipartisan infrastructure law, passed in 2021, allocated billions of dollars to repair bridges, improve highways, and expand truck parking. It also funded pilot programs for electric vehicle charging along the interstates. That is a start, but it is not enough. The interstate system needs a fundamental rethinking. The days of the cheap, fast, and reliable highway are over. The new interstate will have to be smarter, more flexible, and more resilient. That means investing in technology that can predict traffic jams, reroute trucks automatically, and communicate with drivers in real time. It means building parking lots that can accommodate the growing number of trucks, with amenities that make the driver's life less miserable. It means designing the road for the future, not the past. The trucks of tomorrow will be electric, autonomous, or both. They will be quieter, cleaner, and safer, but they will still need the interstate. The concrete will still be there. The signs will still point east and west, north and south. The driver will still be in the cab, watching the miles tick by. The interstate system is not just a relic of the 20th century. It is a living, breathing, evolving organism. It has changed the American trucking industry, and the industry has changed it. The story is not over. It is being written every day, by every driver who pulls onto the on-ramp, by every dispatcher who assigns a load, by every engineer who repaves a stretch of highway. The interstate system is the longest and most ambitious project that Americans have ever built. It is also the most personal. It is the road that carries the food on our tables, the clothes on our backs, and the dreams of the men and women who drive it. And as long as there is freight to move, the interstate will be there, humming with the sound of tires on asphalt, a living monument to the power of a good road. But what does that good road mean for the men and women who live on it day after day? For every statistic about miles driven or tons of freight moved, there is a human story. There is the driver who has seen the sunrise over the Mississippi River 100 times, who knows the exact spot on 80 in Nebraska where the cornfields give way to the prairie, who can tell you which truck stop in Ohio has the best coffee and which one has a shower that actually gets hot. The interstate system is not just a network of concrete and steel. It is a web of memories, of lonely nights and unexpected kindnesses, of close calls and narrow escapes. It is the place where a driver learns to trust their instincts, to read the road ahead like a book, to feel the subtle vibration of a tire about to blow. That knowledge cannot be programmed into a computer. It comes from years of experience, from the thousands of hours spent staring at the white line, from the countless cups of coffee and the endless conversations over the CB radio. The CB radio itself was born on the interstates, a way for drivers to warn each other about speed traps, accidents, and bad weather. It created a community that spanned the continent, a brotherhood of the road that spoke in a code of 10-4s and breakers. That community is fading now, as smartphones and GPS replace the crackle of the radio, but the spirit remains. A driver who is broken down on the shoulder of I-95 can still expect a wave from a passing truck, an offer of help, a shared understanding that the road is a dangerous place and we are all in it together. That shared understanding is what keeps the industry going despite the low pay and the long hours. It is also what makes the interstate system feel like home to some drivers. They know the landmarks, the quirks, the hidden gems. They know that the best breakfast in the country is at a diner just off I-40 in Oklahoma, that the cheapest diesel is at the Flying J near the exit for I-44, that the bridge over the Ohio River on I-65 is always windy and always needs respect. They know that the rest area on I-75 in Georgia is a good place to sleep because it is quiet and well lit, while the one on I-5 in California is a nightmare because the parking lot is too small and the trucks are packed in like sardines. They have learned to navigate the system not by the official maps, but by the unwritten rules. They know that if you are running out of hours and need a place to park, you can pull into a Walmart lot if the store manager does not mind, or you can find a gravel lot behind an old gas station. They know that the interstate is not just a road, it is a lifeline, and they know that the lifeline is fraying. The fraying is visible in the faces of the drivers who have been on the road for too long. They are tired. They are worn down by the stress of the job, by the constant pressure to deliver on time, by the fear of losing their license or their job if they get into an accident. They are tired of eating fast food, of sleeping in a truck that smells like diesel and sweat, of missing their children's birthdays and their anniversaries. They are tired of the loneliness. The interstate system, which was supposed to connect people, has isolated them. A driver can go for days without a real conversation. They talk to dispatchers on the phone, but the dispatcher is just a voice, a number, a schedule. They talk to other drivers on the CB, but the conversation is brief and impersonal. They talk to themselves, to the radio, to the GPS. The silence is deafening. And in that silence, the driver begins to wonder if it is worth it. The pay is not what it used to be. The cost of fuel, insurance, and maintenance is rising. The regulations are getting stricter. The parking is getting harder to find. The interstates are getting more congested. The dream of the open road has become a nightmare of stop-and-go traffic, endless construction zones, and angry motorists who cut off trucks because they do not understand the stopping distance. But there are still moments of grace. There is the moment when a driver crests a hill in Montana and sees the Rockies rising in the distance, purple and snow-capped, and feels a rush of freedom that no office job can provide. There is the moment when a driver pulls into a truck stop and a waitress knows their name and their order, and they feel seen. There is the moment when a driver delivers a load of supplies to a small town that was hit by a storm, and the people are grateful, and the driver remembers that they are not just moving boxes, they are moving hope. Those moments are rare, but they are enough to keep a driver going for another mile, another day, another year. The interstate system is a machine, but it is also a stage for the human drama. The driver is the protagonist, and the highway is the setting. The plot is simple: get the load from point A to point B on time in one piece. But the subplots are endless. There is the dispatcher who is also a mother, trying to balance her job with her family. There is the mechanic who can diagnose an engine problem by the sound alone. There is the scale house inspector who has seen it all and knows when to cut a driver a break. There is the truck stop chaplain who offers a listening ear and a prayer. The interstate system has created a world within a world, a subculture that is invisible to most Americans, but that keeps the economy running. That subculture is changing. The new generation of drivers is different. They are more diverse, more educated, more tech-savvy. They grew up with smartphones and social media, and they expect better working conditions. They are less willing to accept the low pay and the long hours. They are more likely to demand a say in their schedules, more likely to walk away from a job that treats them poorly. The old guard of truckers, the ones who remember the glory days of the 1970s and 1980s, are retiring. They are taking with them the lore of the road, the knowledge of how to fix a broken fan belt with duct tape, the ability to read a map, the patience to wait out a snowstorm in a rest area. The new drivers are more comfortable with technology. They use apps to find parking, to log their hours, to communicate with dispatchers. They are less likely to trust the CB radio and more likely to trust a navigation system that reroutes them around traffic. But technology has its limits. The interstate system is not a simulation. It is real. The potholes are real. The traffic jams are real. The fatigue is real. And no app can replace the judgment of a driver who has been on the road for 20 years. The future of trucking on the interstates will be shaped by a tension between the old and the new. The old is the romance of the open road, the cowboy spirit, the independence. The new is the efficiency of the supply chain, the pressure to lower costs, the promise of autonomous trucks. Autonomous trucks are coming. They are being tested on interstates in Arizona, Texas, and Florida. They promise to reduce accidents, save fuel, and increase productivity. They also threaten to eliminate the driver. The driver who has spent a lifetime learning the road will be replaced by a computer. The truck will drive itself, and the person in the cab will be a monitor, not a pilot. That is a profound shift. The interstate system was built for human drivers with human limits in mind. The rest areas, the truck stops, the diners, the motels are all designed for people. An autonomous truck does not need a shower. It does not need a meal. It does not need a place to sleep. It can run for hours without stopping. That means the entire infrastructure of the trucking industry will have to change. The truck stops will become charging stations. The diners will lose their customers. The motels will close. The culture of the road will fade away. It is a loss that is hard to quantify, but it is real. Yet the interstate system itself will endure. The concrete will still carry the weight. The signs will still point the way. The bridges will still span the rivers. The roads will still hum with the sound of tires. The interstate system changed the American trucking industry in ways that no one could have predicted when President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956. It made the industry faster, cheaper, and more efficient. It also made it harder, more stressful, and more dangerous. It connected the country and disconnected the drivers. It created a network that is the backbone of the economy and a source of endless frustration. The story of the interstate is the story of America itself, ambitious, flawed, monumental, and human. And it is not over. The road goes on. The trucks keep rolling. The drivers keep driving. And as long as there is a load to deliver, the interstate will be there, a living monument to the power of a good road and to the people who travel it.